Story 1, The Whispering Woods. I've always been an avid hiker, drawn to the remote trails that most people avoided. I craved isolation, the kind that made the world fall away and left only me in the wild. I'd heard rumors about a place upstate, deep in the mountains, called the Whispering Woods. Its name was both eerie and alluring. Supposedly, hikers who ventured too far into those woods either never came back or returned with stories that didn't make sense. Ramblings of voices, shadows that moved unnaturally, and overwhelming feelings of being watched. Naturally, I had to check it out for myself. It was a crisp autumn day when I set out, the kind where the chill in the air felt refreshing. The trailhead was barely marked, a simple wooden signpost with the words Whispering Woods etched into it. Not many ventured here, but that only made it more appealing to me. I was used to tough hikes, but something about this one felt different from the start. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if the usual background noise of chirping birds and rustling leaves had been muted. All I could hear were my own footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. A wee few hours in, I noticed something strange. The trees were growing denser, their gnarled branches twisting together overhead like skeletal fingers. And the deeper I went, the darker it became, as if the sun itself was being swallowed by the forest. I checked my watch. It wasn't late enough for the light to fade like this. That's when I heard it for the first time. A whisper at first. I thought it was the wind, but as I stopped to listen, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a rustle through the leaves. It was words, though too faint for me to make out. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I started to feel it. That gnawing sensation in the back of my neck. Like 1,000 eyes were boring into me from all directions. I'm not easily spooked, but this was different, primal, instinctual. I wasn't alone out there. I could feel it, though I saw no one. About an hour later, the trail began to vanish. The path I'd been following so carefully was now obscured by overgrowth. No matter how hard I tried to retrace my steps, I couldn't find my way back. I was lost. I forced myself to stay calm and took out my compass, but when I looked at it, the needle was spinning erratically. I tapped it, shook it, but it refused to settle on a direction. I had never seen anything like it. That's when the whispering started again. Only this time, it was clearer. Turn back. My heart thudded in my chest. It wasn't in my head. I wasn't imagining it. I spun around, trying to pinpoint where the voice was coming from, but it seemed to echo from all directions, surrounding me. Turn back. While you still can. I should have listened, but I didn't. Instead, I pushed forward, desperate to find my way out. The trees seemed to close in even tighter, and the air grew colder. It was like the forest itself was swallowing me whole. That's when I saw them, figures standing just beyond the trees, their shapes barely visible through the thick fog that had crept in. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I called out, thinking maybe they were other hikers, but they didn't respond. They just stood there. Then, as I took a step closer, they vanished. I'm not ashamed to admit I started to panic. I turned around, trying to backtrack. But the figures were everywhere now. Shadowy forms that appeared in my peripheral vision, only to disappear when I looked directly at them. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Leave before it's too late. I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to escape, when I felt something cold brush against my arm. I jerked away, but there was no one there. Then again, the touch. Cold, clammy, like a dead hand grazing my skin. My breath came in ragged gasps as I broke into a run. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out. The voices followed me, growing louder, more frantic. Run. Run. You don't belong here. Suddenly, I tripped, my foot catching on something buried in the leaves. I hit the ground hard. the wind knocked out of me. When I looked back to see what had caused me to fall, my blood ran cold. It was a hand. Not a real hand, but the skeletal remains of one, reaching out of the ground like it had been trying to claw its way to the surface. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet. But everywhere I looked, more of them were sticking up from the ground. Bones scattered across the forest floor like a grim reminder of those who had come before me. And then, the final whisper came, loud and clear, spoken directly into my ear. "You're next." I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life, not caring where I was going, just wanting to escape. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst out of the forest and into a clearing. The sunlight hit my face and I collapsed, gasping for air. When I finally dared to look back, the woods were silent and still. The shadows gone. I never told anyone what happened that day. I never reported the bones, or the voices, or the figures, because I knew no one would believe me. And truth be told, I barely believe it myself. But every night since then, when I lie in bed, I hear them. The whispers, faint and distant at first, but growing louder as the hours pass. And I can't shake the feeling that they're getting closer. Story. To nightfall at Hollow Creek. I've always loved night fishing. The quiet, the calm, the solitude. All of it felt like a retreat from the daily grind. So when my buddy Rick told me about a secluded spot called Hollow Creek, deep in the woods, a few hours out of town, I didn't hesitate. He swore by it, saying the fish were plentiful and hardly anyone knew about the place. "It's a little eerie at night," he said, "but nothing crazy, just don't stay out too late." I should have asked him what he meant by that last part, but I brushed it off as him trying to mess with me. Eerie or not, I packed my gear and headed out after work the next Friday. I liked the idea of being out there alone, with nothing but the stars, the water, and the fish to keep me company. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows over the narrow dirt road. Hollow Creek wasn't exactly easy to find. The path was overgrown, and the only indication I was in the right place was an old, weathered sign barely hanging onto a wooden post that read, "Hollow Creek" in faded letters. I parked by the water's edge, the truck's headlights reflecting off the inky surface of the creek. It wasn't a large body of water, more like a wide, slow-moving river that seemed to disappear into the dense woods. Tall trees crowded the shoreline, their branches stretching out like bony fingers. And an unsettling fog began to roll in as the last bit of sunlight faded. I shrugged it off. Nothing unusual for the area. Right, just part of the atmosphere. I grabbed my gear, set up near the bank, and cast my line. The water was calm, barely a ripple, except for where my line landed. I took a deep breath, settling into my chair with a thermos of coffee. The world seemed to quiet down. The sounds of the forest fading into the background as the night fully set in. Time passed slowly, the rhythmic sound of the creek almost lulling me to sleep. It wasn't until about an hour in that I felt the first tug on my line. I jolted awake, my heart skipping a beat. Something was biting and it felt big. I gripped the rod, bracing myself as I began to reel it in. But whatever was on the other end, it wasn't fighting like any fish I'd ever caught. It was heavier, almost like I'd hooked onto something lodged in the creek bed. I gave a hard pull and suddenly the line slackened. I cursed under my breath, thinking I'd lost whatever it was. Then I saw it. Something surfaced a few feet out, just where my line had been. A dark shape floated on the water, bobbing gently. At first I thought it was a log, but as it drifted closer, I realized it was far too smooth and too pale to be wood. I squinted, leaning over the edge of the bank to get a better look. The fog made it hard to see clearly, but there was no mistaking it now. It was a body. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my chair. The body floated closer, face down, its arms outstretched, as if reaching for something. My mind raced. Should I call The police. What if someone was hurt? But how could they have ended up here? Just as I reached for my phone, a low gurgling sound broke the silence. It was faint, almost like a bubbling beneath the surface of the water. I froze, my hand hovering over my pocket as the body twitched. It wasn't just drifting anymore. It was moving. The corpse slowly turned in the water, its head tilting upward until it was facing me. Pale, waterlogged skin hung loosely over its bones, and empty eye sockets stared up at me from a bloated face. I gasped, my stomach twisting in revulsion. But then the eyes blinked. I stumbled backward, heart racing, as the body started to rise from the water. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it lifted itself up onto the bank, its limbs moving with unnatural jerky motions. The gurgling sound grew louder, like something was crawling up from the depths, pulling this thing along with it. "Help!" A voice rasped from the corpse's mouth, wet and garbled. "Help me." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like lead, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. It dragged itself closer, water pooling around its rotting form as it pulled itself onto the bank, its dead eyes never leaving mine. The air grew colder, my breath coming out in white puffs as the fog thickened around me. "Help!" it said again, its voice no longer a plea but a command. I finally found my legs, backing up toward the truck, my eyes wide as I watched it crawl toward me. Its fingers, gnarled and twisted, dug into the mud, pulling its decayed body closer and closer. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to gather my gear, didn't even look back. My boots slipped on the wet ground as I sprinted to the truck, my heart hammering in my chest. I could still hear it behind me, that gurgling voice, those wet, dragging sounds as it pursued me. I slammed the truck door shut and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me a few tries to jam them into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I floored it, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped down the narrow road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen, but there was no explaining it. No rational way to justify what had happened. I never went back for my gear. I never even told Rick. How could I? How could I explain that I'd been chased by something dead? A week later, I read a news report. A body had washed up in Hollow Creek. The authorities didn't know who it was or how long it had been in the water, but they suspected foul play. I tried to tell myself that it had nothing to do with what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew better. Hollow Creek wasn't just eerie. It wasn't just another forgotten fishing spot. It was something far worse. Something alive. Or at least, something that once was. And I don't think it will ever stop looking for help.